Hi everyone, this is Ali John Chaudhary, and today I'm here with Fern Schumer Chapman, author. And today we're going to be talking about a very important subject because we're going to be going into sibling estrangement and falling into false narratives. I think this is a very important subject because some families are able to be more well-rounded and get beyond contentious issues in a safe and respectable way. Other families, however, may have certain times of difficulties in staying, for example, stuck with certain themes, and worse, ascribe blame to some of us in a bullying type of fashion. So today we'll be exploring how this general dynamic can manifest in families and with siblings, and how to get beyond this. So Fern, it's great to have you here. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. And when I talk to clients, I hear a lot about this, and I'm often challenging what I call false narratives. One of the most common places you see this is when two siblings fall into different financial brackets, and one becomes somewhat envious and jealous, and also starts to take on this sense that they are not as good as the other one who's made more money. And this can create a pretty big divide. And in fact, this is a risk factor for estrangement. So, I think it's great that we're talking about false narratives because a lot of times you have to challenge those perceptions.
Absolutely. And I think that a lot of times people seek explanations and justifications for how they feel and such. And I think it's really, really important to be careful not to fall into this trap where we can end up becoming defensive, right? When all of a sudden we may feel that somebody's too good for us and such, or that they just can't relate to us anymore and such, then yes, it can cause our siblings, particularly, to become more reactive towards us. And that's hard when you're having to navigate through this type of false narrative, right? Because it's not really yours to begin with. And when you're on the receiving end of it, you're trying to defend yourself from something that is not something that you necessarily see or feel yourself. So that can really be a tailspin unto itself.
Well, I think what people do, Ollie John, is they collect bits of information and then they connect the dots and then they draw conclusions. And once you've got that in place, you don't want to hear somebody else's perspective or be challenged in any way because this is what you believe to be true. And actually, it's not all that different from what we're seeing in a larger scale politically, where people don't know how to hear each other and talk to each other.
You're so right. I think when it comes to this, right, how this fixates itself on people's identity and such, right? How it is that people hold on to this as though it's part of them and such. And for somebody to try to dispel that by saying, well, wait a minute, this isn't the full picture here, then what ends up happening is people become threatened by that because it for them it can often be seen as an invalidation, which ends up cranking them up even more. Right? And like you said, you're absolutely right. We see this on a political level, and this is where conversations become paralyzed because a lot of times people polarize themselves into these types of narratives where they stay locked in, whether they're true or false, they stay locked into it, and there's no opening for discussion.
Well, and I want to say what you said again because I think it's so important. They adopt it as their identity.
Mhm.
And that's where we get into real trouble because they're not of a growth mindset where they're actually thinking, how can I learn and how can I be curious? Instead, what they're doing is assembling information that supports their arguments.
Yeah, exactly. So they're leading themselves down a road where they're basically exercising their own personal bias, right? In that sense, and that ends up creating false conclusions, right? And false narratives. And unfortunately, we see this sometimes also with people that buy into some conspiracy theories, right? Because they add that incomplete information. They add these different pieces and layers together to come up with some sort of conclusion that is not always based on fact. And I often come back to this idea, right, of having people verify their perceptions. Are you sure about that? Did you go and verify that with the person that's concerned about what you're saying here, that involves them and such? Maybe might be a good idea just to go and see if that's the case or not, right?
I think core beliefs often drive these false narratives, and they come from childhood. And so we go out looking to reinforce those core beliefs. And if you look hard enough, you're going to find them. I'm not worthy. I'm not seen. I'm not lovable. And you see this often in divides with siblings.
Exactly, right? And when you have people feeling as though they're left behind and such, what ends up happening in cases like that is that people get defensive. They want to hold on to their narrative. They want to hold on to what feels important to them. And that's the thing that happens with this, especially, right?
What feels familiar to them.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's that sense of familiarity that makes that it becomes a part of somebody's identity and such. That's why we see this sometimes with a lot of identity politics, I think sometimes, right? In some cases because of that. And I think that unfortunately this plays itself out in families as well, not just in politics, but in other areas of life. And this is what creates a sense of strife and a sense of friction and I would say sometimes a breaking down of communication altogether because of the fact that people can't see beyond that once they're stuck into it. Because for them it's personal. For them it's something that matters to them, and that's they want to desperately keep in touch with that part that they so hold true to be inside of themselves.
This is why I believe so deeply in what we're doing, because I don't think this is just about the personal or the family. I think communication skills are developed within the family, and we take them out into the larger world, and we create societies, we create culture, all based on this.
Hmm.
So it has a very long reach. And that's why these false narratives gain so much traction.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that's really, really important to be mindful of that and to recognize also, right, that we need to create rapport with people, right? We need to make sure that we don't fall into an echo chamber, right, where it's just the same thing we keep hearing over and over again, or simply hearing other people espouse the same point of view or seek out others and only listen to others that have that similar point of view. We really need to be careful about that and remain balanced in our own ways of seeing things. Because otherwise, when we buy into a narrative that may end up not being true, then what ends up happening is we can be misled and take actions that correspond to that false narrative that can end up snowballing and perhaps creating alienation, creating moments of estrangement, awkwardness, where the relationship can break down with siblings and such or other family members. And that's where it becomes especially dangerous is when it starts to affect people's actions or sense of involvement with others and such. It's important to consider a person in a more well-rounded type of way, right? That we don't fall into necessarily stereotypes or typing people in such a way that they're only that. Even if you tend to think that way, that they're a certain way, okay, maybe somebody's a little bit more stubborn, maybe somebody is maybe doing more grandstanding, etc. However you see them as, they're not just that. They're more than that, right? And that's important to be able to get beyond that so that we can understand exactly what may cause division, right? And sometimes it is about having safe conversations with people that we've talked about before, right? Sometimes surface level conversations, right? Start with general subjects and such that are safe. We don't need to go into what divides us necessarily in the beginning, right? Talking more about what unites us, talking about the commonalities, some of the past experiences that bring people together.
Shared, shared experiences, yeah. Um, Whether it's personal or it's political, there are three words that should be your that you should be leaning on all the time, and that is tell me more. So instead of simply reacting, particularly in a political situation, to somebody's stance, you have to be curious. And that's that growth mindset. Tell me more. How
Hmm.
can I understand how you feel?
Yeah, Exactly,
I mean,
right?
what is the point of being human if we can't reach across and identify with somebody else's feelings and pain?
Absolutely. And I think that's really, really important, right? It's validating the other person's emotional experience, right? And we've talked about that, how important that is, right? Getting beyond who's right and who's wrong, right? And a lot of times that's what I end up doing in therapy with people is I often talk about, okay, well, what is the emotional experience here for each party? Right? So that way, if the other person's able to name what the other person is bringing and feeling and such, then they're already sharpening their skills in reading the other person emotionally speaking. So that way, you're not getting into who's right and who's wrong. I try to avoid that because that's not really conducive to moving forward. What moves people forward is, like you said, right? Tell me more. What brings us together? What is it that we can have, that we can recognize in one another, that we can build from, right?
Right.
That's what's important.
Those are the watchwords. Tell me more.
Yeah.
It's so easy to slip into reactive mode or defensive mode, and that's what you're trying to guard against.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's really, really important, right? We don't want to fall into that type of mode where we cut ourselves off, where
Mhm.
we end up becoming overly defensive, where
Mhm.
we end up othering the other. We've talked about that as well, I think, especially before, right? When we tend to marginalize other people in the family and such, then it can be really hard for us to be able to see them in a more well-rounded fashion. So already trying to humanize the other person, keeping that humanity in your own mind of who they can be is especially important. So
Right.
when you're doing that, then you're not dehumanizing them, you're rehumanizing them.
And also not triangulating because there's
Right.
a real quick fix to some of this that people lean on, and it's really unhealthy. And that is to talk about somebody else in the family and be negative or judgmental in that way. And that ends up just creating more problems.
Yeah, exactly. And be free to disagree when somebody t tries to triangulate, right? Because I think that's important. You don't need to necessarily let the other person have what they're looking for if you don't necessarily agree with that mindset or that false narrative. You're free to disagree, and you can end up actually creating an opportunity to have more of a well-rounded type of view of the other person when you are put in a position where you may have to justify who they are as a person without necessarily siding with them. You're still able to nonetheless acknowledge the other person's virtues and such without falling into prey into blacklisting them and demonizing them and such.
Or just saying, I'm not comfortable with this. I don't really want to talk about it. It's not,
Exactly.
I mean, my policy is not to just not to engage in this stuff because you never know where it's going to go.
Exactly. So we have a choice when we're faced with somebody trying to espouse a false narrative, whether we want to engage with that or simply steer the conversation elsewhere, right? In that sense, so that way you don't fall prey to that in acknowledging that or reaffirming something that you may not necessarily agree with, right?
Right.
Be very mindful of that and such. Sometimes people want to buy the piece and just say yes, yes, yes. But the thing though is that if you say yes to something that you don't agree with, then that can also cause confusion. That can reaffirm a false belief. And again, that may cause future misunderstandings and such. So just being mindful of that, I think, especially is important when you're uncomfortable with a subject matter, like you said, simply steering it somewhere else, saying that you rather talk about something else, or even just gently doing it without necessarily saying you want to change subjects. You can even just steer it towards another person's interests as just a means of buying the piece and bringing tension down. And if you're doing that, then you're actually showing them also how to rehumanize somebody else.
Triangulation can perpetuate false narratives. So that's why I bring it up and reinforce false narratives. And you really don't want to be rubber stamping that.
Exactly. Exactly. Fern, this has been a great subject. I think we're almost out of time, as a matter
Oh,
of fact. It goes by so, so fast when we talk about this. But I think that with today's episode, we've given some pointers in terms of how to work with this when this happens. What does this look like? And what this can cause people to feel also, which I think is especially important. So I'm very happy with where this has gone today. So let's talk about resources. What would be your number one resource at this time, Fern?
Well, I guess I'd go with the Sibling Estrangement Journal, which is an opportunity to sort through your feelings on the page. And for those who are in difficult sibling relationships or estranged, I think it's a pretty valuable resource.
It's a great resource. I like it a lot as well, too. Very practical and hands-on, and so yes, definitely recommend that. My number one resource is the Sibling Estrangement Support Group on Zoom. That's happening every couple of weeks. So I invite people to reach out to me or on the Facebook page, Sibling Estrangement Sharing, Coping, Connecting, to get in touch with me and seeing when is the next group and such. And I also am doing another workshop in the fall on navigating the stages of grief with sibling estrangement. So this is going to be a two-session workshop with me. If people want to have a roadmap in terms of where to go, how to best navigate this type of grief, then this is the workshop you've been waiting for. So I'm very happy to be offering this again in the fall. So yeah, so get in touch with me if that speaks to you especially. So Fern, this has been a wonderful episode. Thanks again so much for doing this. I'm so look forward to us getting together like this and talking about matters associated to sibling estrangement.
Me too. Thanks again.
All right, you take care. Thanks.